In the heart of the command center, the deafening sound of a missile striking the Black Hawk reverberated through the room. 6 soldiers and a senior officer were now trapped in hostile territory, with a relentless storm closing in. The rescue operation at Fort Darnell was quickly spiraling into disaster, and the clock was ticking. Amid the chaos, an unnoticed figure stood quietly in the corner. Recruit Ella Matthews, a 22-year-old observer, whose input was dismissed time and again. Colonel Davis, his face etched with frustration, surveyed the situation. "We need experienced men for this extraction," he barked. The storm raged outside, mirroring the growing tension within. Senior officers shouted over each other, debating rescue routes that would take hours, all while ignoring the one person who might hold the key to a quicker solution. With calm determination, Ella stepped forward, her green eyes locked on the digital terrain map. "Sir," she began, "there's a natural passage through the ravine that could cut down the time significantly." Her voice was barely heard before Colonel Davis dismissed her idea without a second glance. "Did I ask for your input, recruit?" he snapped. Turning back to the other officers, Ella, undeterred, stepped back. 3 months at Fort Darnell had taught her that in this world, women were invisible until they proved themselves. As the officers debated futilely, Ella's mind raced. The base had been conducting joint exercises all week, and she had studied every inch of the training grounds. What they saw as impassable terrain, she recognized as a hidden path that could lead them straight to the crash site. With the storm worsening, Ella couldn't wait for the green light that might never come. She quietly slipped out of the command center, determined to act while the higher-ups argued protocol. Outside, she found 2 soldiers she knew from training, Private Sam Jenkins and Corporal Luis Ramirez. Despite their hesitation, Ella convinced them to join her in defying orders. "We're risking everything," Jenkins warned, but Ella's resolve was unshaken. "If we wait, those men will die." "I'm going," she stated firmly, gathering emergency gear. 10 minutes later, they were on their way, and not a single officer was aware of their absence. The storm battered them as they made their way through dense forest. The terrain quickly became treacherous, but Ella was focused. She relied on her knowledge of geological surveys maps that no one else had studied. As they reached the ravine, a crack of thunder split the air, but Ella pressed on, determined to prove her worth and save the lives of those stranded in the wreckage. This was more than a mission now. It was her moment to show that sometimes, in the face of disaster, doing what's right means breaking the rules. The storm had become a force of nature, howling through the dense forest as Ella Matthews, Private Sam Jenkins, and Corporal Luis Ramirez made their way toward the crash site. The air was thick with tension, their boots sinking into the mud with every step, the visibility reduced to mere feet. The helicopter's downed wreckage lay just ahead, the smell of burning fuel already reaching their senses as they neared the site. Ella's mind raced as they approached, but there was no turning back now. She had to get to the wreckage. General Coleman, the same officer who had personally approved her role as an observer, was among the wounded. She knew time was running out. The storm, which had made travel near impossible, was only worsening. Every decision made now would determine life or death. "Stay focused," Ella commanded, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. The men behind her were starting to question the risk. "If you're wrong about this path, we're all dead," Jenkins shouted over the roar of the wind. His medical kit clutched tightly, but Ella didn't flinch. She knew the terrain better than anyone. Her study of geological surveys and county archives had prepared her for moments like this, when every second counted and rules had to be bent to save lives. As the team scrambled down the final stretch of the ravine, Ella spotted a column of smoke through the trees, a sign they were nearing the crash site. Her heart raced, but she remained calm, focused on the task ahead. When they finally emerged from the thick tree line, the scene before them was worse than Ella could have imagined. The Black Hawk lay in pieces, its rotors shattered, smoke billowing from the engine compartment. Bodies were scattered across the site, some moving weakly, others still. Without hesitation, Ella took charge. "Jenkins, triage. Ramirez, secure the perimeter," she ordered. Already sprinting toward the wreckage, She could hear weak coughing from inside the twisted cabin. "General Coleman, can you hear me?" she called out, climbing onto the slippery fuselage. The sound of his faint response was a relief, but there was no time to waste. She assessed the situation quickly. 4 survivors, including General Coleman. 2 soldiers were trapped, but they were alive. Ella and her team worked tirelessly, using every ounce of training they had to stabilize the injured and evacuate them from the wreckage before the helicopter exploded. They had no communication with Fort Darnell, no way of letting them know they had reached the crash site, and yet they carried on. The urgency in the air was palpable. Fuel was leaking. The storm still raged, and every minute brought them closer to disaster. As they made their way to a safer location, Ella had no idea that her actions would soon be questioned by those back at the base. The officers at Fort Darnell had no knowledge of the daring rescue she had initiated, and Colonel Davis's fury would soon come to a head. But for now, Ella's mind was focused solely on getting the wounded to safety and on the promise she made to herself that doing what was right always trumps following orders blindly. The storm raged on, its fury matching the tension Ella Matthews felt in her chest as she and her team trudged through the increasingly treacherous terrain. With every step, the mud threatened to pull them down, but Ella's focus never wavered. General Coleman and the rest of the survivors were depending on them. The rain lashed at her face, stinging her eyes. But she kept her mind clear, calculating every move. "Stay close. Keep moving," she called out to Jenkins and Ramirez, the wind howling in her ears. They had no radio communication with Fort Darnell, no way of updating command on their progress. But Ella knew that the longer they waited for the official rescue team, the more likely it was that those stranded would die from the storm or the crash injuries. She had studied every map, every geological survey of the area, and she knew there was a way through. It was uncharted, a path barely known to anyone but her, and it was their only hope. As they pushed forward, the ravine grew narrower, the path even more dangerous. They were forced to scramble along a precarious ledge, barely wide enough to fit in single file. Jenkins, normally unshaken, looked to Ella, his face pale with fear. "If you're wrong about this path, we're all dead," he shouted, his voice filled with dread. But Ella didn't flinch. She had no room for doubt. This was her moment to prove that thinking outside the box, taking risks when others wouldn't, could save lives. The further they moved, the more perilous the journey became. Lightning flashed, and the wind picked up, threatening to send them tumbling down into the abyss below. But Ella remained resolute, keeping her eyes fixed ahead. As they neared the crash site, the familiar, unsettling sight of smoke rising through the trees confirmed they were on track. Their pace quickened. Finally, they reached the site. The wreckage of the Black Hawk was scattered across the mountainside, with soldiers lying injured, some moaning weakly, others unconscious. The chaos was overwhelming, but Ella was already in command. "Jenkins, triage. Ramirez, secure the perimeter," she ordered. She could hear a faint cough from inside the twisted wreckage. As she made her way to the cabin, her heart pounded. The general was still alive. Inside, the scene was grim. General Coleman was pinned beneath debris, his leg crushed. 2 soldiers were also trapped. Without hesitation, Ella began working quickly, moving debris, stabilizing the injured. Time was running out. The storm intensified, and the fuel from the wreckage began to leak, making the situation even more dangerous. With urgency, Ella and Ramirez managed to free the general and get him to safety, while Jenkins worked on the other soldiers. Every decision they made now could mean life or death. As they moved the wounded away from the wreckage, Ella could hear the rumble of thunder in the distance, and a sudden explosion ripped through the air. The Black Hawk had erupted in flames, but they weren't done yet. They had to get the wounded to a safer location, and Ella knew the only chance was to reach a meadow half a mile away. It was a dangerous journey, but the only option they had. Every second mattered. "We keep moving," she ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos. As they reached the meadow, Ella quickly set up emergency flares to signal for extraction. The storm had begun to subside slightly, but they couldn't afford to wait much longer. As Ella worked to secure the area, she couldn't help but wonder how her actions would be received. She had defied orders, taken matters into her own hands, and led her team to safety. But would the higher-ups at Fort Darnell see it as a bold move or a reckless violation of protocol? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she didn't let it show. Her team had made it this far. Now, they just had to survive long enough to be rescued. As Ella Matthews and her team waited in the clearing, the storm continued to rage around them, the gusts of wind making it nearly impossible to hear anything beyond the deafening roar of the sky. They had barely made it to the meadow, but they knew they couldn't stop now. General Coleman, still breathing but severely injured, had been stabilized and was lying on a makeshift stretcher. His injuries were grave, a compound fracture in his leg, possibly internal bleeding, but Jenkins, though exhausted and visibly shaken, kept monitoring the vital signs of the other wounded soldier. While Ramirez worked quickly to mark the area for the incoming helicopter, Ella's mind, however, was focused on one thing: survival. The storm had not only made the terrain treacherous, but had also interfered with communication. Their radios couldn't get through the mountains. Just as they were finishing their preparations, Ella climbed to the highest point of the meadow and flicked on the radio once more. The static buzzed through him. The silence that followed stretched out, each second an eternity. Then, finally, a voice came through. "Recruit Matthews. This is Major General Wallace. Status report on General Coleman." Over. Ella's heart skipped a beat. It was the base commander himself. She quickly relayed the general's condition, not hesitating for even a second. Compound fracture of the right femur, possible internal bleeding, but stable for now. "Sir," she reported, "permission to speak freely." "Sir?" There was a brief pause before Wallace's voice crackled back. "Granted. We need that helicopter now," Ella said firmly, aware that they were running out of time. "The storm is clearing, but it won't last." Over. "Extraction team is spinning up. ETA 15 minutes if the weather window holds." "Well done, recruit. Hold position. Out." The words hung in the air, and for the first time since the mission began, Ella allowed herself a breath of relief. She turned back to her team, who were preparing the wounded for transport. The helicopter would arrive in 15 minutes, but every minute counted. "They're coming," she said softly, her voice betraying a hint of exhaustion, as she kept her eyes trained on the sky, hoping the storm wouldn't pick up again. Her thoughts drifted to the ones who had doubted her. Colonel Davis had been furious at her actions, dismissing her suggestion without thought. But in the end, she had made the right call. The sound of helicopter rotors sliced through the air, and the group's attention shifted immediately. "They're coming in too fast for this terrain," Jenkins commented anxiously. No, Ella replied, her eyes locked on the descending helicopter. "They're threading the needle perfectly." The helicopter touched down with precision, and medical teams rushed forward, immediately taking over the care of General Coleman and the others. But as the medics worked on the injured, General Coleman, still struggling with pain, grabbed Ella's arm. "This isn't over, recruit," he said, his voice hoarse. "I want you on this helicopter." Ella shook her head. "My team and I will hike back." "Sir, there's no room with all the medical staff." "That wasn't a request," Coleman said firmly. Minutes later, the helicopter ascended, flying above the storm clouds. Ella sat quietly, her eyes on the distant lights of Fort Darnell, knowing that she had just made a decision that would change everything. When they reached the base, the mood was different. The storm had passed, but the real test was only beginning. Would her actions be seen as a necessary risk or a breach of protocol? Despite the uncertainty, one thing was clear: Ella Matthews had proved that sometimes following protocol was not enough. In the face of life and death, doing what was right meant breaking the rules, and she would stand by that decision, no matter the consequences. As the helicopter descended toward Fort Darnell, Ella Matthews sat silently, her thoughts racing. The events of the past hours had been a whirlwind, one that had started with the crashing of a Black Hawk and culminated in a life-or-death rescue that no one could have predicted. Her decision to take matters into her own hands had saved General Coleman and the other wounded soldiers. But at what cost? She had defied direct orders, disobeyed the chain of command, and acted without the official approval of her superiors. The storm had cleared, but the consequences of her actions were still looming. When the helicopter touched down, The base was already on high alert. The emergency medical team immediately took charge of the wounded, and within moments, Colonel Davis stormed into view, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief. As Ella stepped off the helicopter, her uniform caked in mud and her face streaked with scratches from the branches. She stood tall, facing the colonel with unwavering resolve. "Recruit Matthews," Colonel Davis bellowed. "You disobeyed direct orders, stole equipment, endangered the lives of 2 soldiers, and interfered with an official rescue operation." His voice was low, a simmering fury beneath his words. "Do you have any idea the charges you're facing?" Ella didn't flinch. "I'm here, sir, and I've done what was necessary. Those soldiers are alive because of the decisions I made. I'll stand by them." Behind the colonel, Jenkins and Ramirez were escorted off the second helicopter that had brought them back from the meadow. Their faces were stoic, but their eyes met Ella's, a silent understanding between them. They had followed her, risked their careers, but they hadn't once questioned her leadership. "Are you aware of the consequences of your actions?" Colonel Davis pressed, stepping closer to her, his face inches away. "Insubordination, dereliction of duty. I'll have you court-martialed before sunrise." "I've accepted the consequences," Ella replied, her voice calm but firm. "I did what I had to do to save lives. No amount of paperwork or protocol would have done that." The tense standoff was broken when Lieutenant Brooks, a more senior officer, stepped forward, suggesting the conversation take place in private. But Colonel Davis was resolute, insisting that this discussion be held publicly. The eyes of the gathered soldiers and officers were upon them, a silent audience to the clash between protocol and pragmatism. The next moments were a blur. Just as Davis prepared to continue his tirade, General Coleman, still wounded but determined, hobbled into the scene, leaning on a crutch. His presence was commanding, despite his injuries. "Enough," he said sharply, raising his hand to silence the colonel. "I'll handle this," Coleman continued, his gaze locking onto Ella. "Recruit Matthews, do you know why I chose you for this mission?" He paused for a moment, his voice softer now. "Because I saw something in you, an ability to think on your feet, to act when others hesitate. You saved lives today, when protocol would have left them to die." The room was silent, as the general's words hung in the air. Davis, his face drained of color, could barely respond. Coleman's next words were a direct blow to Davis's authority. "Your team was hours away. Recruit Matthews was the only one who got there in time." The crowd, which had been watching with bated breath, now began to murmur. The reality was sinking in. Ella had acted not out of insubordination, but out of necessity. Her quick thinking had saved the day. As General Coleman turned to face the officers, he made his final decision. "Colonel Davis, you're reassigned. I'm placing you under review for command training." The weight of the moment didn't fully hit Ella until she saw Davis's face, a mix of humiliation and rage. But in that moment, she knew that her actions, no matter how they had been viewed by some, had been the right ones. As the crowd dispersed, and the officers began to turn their attention elsewhere, Jenkins and Ramirez approached Ella, their expressions filled with respect. "Worth it?" Ramirez asked quietly. Ella smiled, the exhaustion finally setting in. "Every second," she replied, knowing that, despite everything, she had done what was right, and that was all that mattered. The next morning, the tension at Fort Darnell was palpable. The sun had barely risen, but the headquarters building was already abuzz with activity. Ella Matthews had spent the night in the barracks, reflecting on the events that had unfolded and preparing herself for what was to come. She had saved lives. General Coleman and the other soldiers were alive because of her quick thinking, but the fallout from her defiance of orders was just beginning. As the sun rose, her mission had changed, but the purpose remained the same: to do what was right, even if it meant breaking protocol. At precisely 6:58 mm, ella, flanked by Jenkins and Ramirez, stepped into the building, their uniforms immaculate despite the exhaustion that clung to them. The night had been long, but their posture betrayed no fatigue. They were soldiers, and soldiers followed orders. Yet Ella had chosen to make her own decisions when the stakes were life and death. She could feel the eyes of the base personnel on them as they walked through the hallways. The rumor mill had already begun. The recruit who wasn't a recruit. The rescue that shouldn't have worked. The captain who had been hiding in plain sight. In front of Major General Wallace's office, they were met by Colonel Davis, who was pacing nervously in the hallway. His eyes narrowed as he saw them approach. The anger that had been building in him all night was now on full display. Enjoying your last moments in uniform, he sneered at them, his voice dripping with disdain. Before anyone could respond, the door to the office opened, and General Coleman stepped out, still leaning on his crutch, but holding himself with an air of authority. "All of you, inside," he commanded, inside the office. The atmosphere was tense. Major General Wallace sat behind his desk, flanked by several high-ranking officers. A video conference screen displayed 2 more generals watching remotely. The room was heavy with expectation. Colonel Davis was already prepared to lay the blame on Ella for her insubordination, but General Coleman had other plans. "Colonel Davis," Coleman began, his voice steady and measured, "you've made your position clear. Recruit Matthews violated direct orders, but in the end, her actions saved lives." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You were still hours away when she reached us. Your rigid adherence to protocol would have left those men to die." The room was still, everyone waiting for Davis's response. Colonel Davis, looking visibly shaken, tried to defend his position, but the chain of command— "Enough!" General Coleman cut him off, his eyes cold. "Your rescue plan would have arrived too late. The recruit's actions, while unconventional, were exactly what the situation called for." With the tension thick in the air, Major General Wallace spoke next. "Colonel Davis, you are reassigned to Fort Benning for retraining. You have failed to recognize the importance of flexibility and leadership during emergencies." Ella, standing silently before the gathering of officers, felt a quiet sense of vindication. She had acted when others hesitated, and now, despite the fallout, she knew she had made the right call. The chain of command had been broken, but in breaking it, she had saved lives. As Colonel Davis left the room, his career hanging by a thread, General Coleman turned to Ella. "Your assessment will continue. Matthews, report back in 1 week." There was no bitterness in his tone, only respect. As they walked out of the office, Jenkins and Ramirez flanked Ella, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and admiration. They had followed her without question, and now, in the aftermath, they knew they had made the right choice. The silence between them spoke volumes. Ella's defiance had not only saved lives, but it had also proven that sometimes, in the face of danger, breaking the rules was the only way to truly serve. "You think it was worth it?" Ramirez asked quietly. Ella's lips curved into a small smile. "Every second," she replied, knowing that she had done the right thing, regardless of the consequences. As the days passed after the explosive rescue mission, Ella Matthews knew that the consequences of her actions at Fort Darnell were far from over. General Coleman, the man whose life she had saved, had made his decision clear. He had been impressed by her initiative, her ability to think outside of protocol, and her unflinching determination to do what was right. But for Colonel Davis and the rest of the command structure, Ella's defiance was something they couldn't easily overlook. The system had been shaken, and Ella had become the focal point of a storm that was now set to make waves. The command staff at Fort Darnell, still processing the aftermath of her unauthorized rescue, was tense. Colonel Davis, humiliated by General Coleman's decision, was now publicly questioning her methods. His face betrayed both fury and disbelief, but there was nothing he could do about it. The base was abuzz with rumors some soldiers whispered about the recruit, who had turned out to be more than anyone had imagined. Some saw her as a hero who saved lives when others hesitated, while others saw her as a rogue agent, one who had broken the rules and potentially set a dangerous precedent. As Ella prepared for her debriefing, the tension in the air was thick with the knowledge that this wasn't just about one rescue mission. It was about the principles that underpinned military operations, the balance between following protocol and making life or death decisions. General Coleman had already made it clear that he respected her decisions, but the higher-ups weren't as understanding. The question now was whether the military could evolve to recognize that sometimes saving lives meant breaking the rules. When the day of her assessment arrived, the atmosphere in the room was formal and severe. Ella stood at attention, ready to face whatever consequences might come her way. She had no regrets about her actions. Every step she had taken, every decision she had made, had been to save lives. The officers present knew it, too. As much as they tried to adhere to protocol, they couldn't deny the stark reality. The rescue had succeeded because Ella had defied orders and acted when no one else would. As she stood there, her mind drifted to the storm that had preceded the rescue. Not the one in the sky, but the storm within the base, the conflict between tradition and necessity, between the established chain of command and the instinct to act when every second counted. Her heart remained steady because she knew she had made the right choice, and that was something she would always carry with her. The day might come when others would be faced with similar decisions, and perhaps, just perhaps, they would remember what Ella Matthews had done when the storm raged, and the rules became secondary to saving lives. "Do you have anything to say in your defense, Recruit Matthews?" the lead officer finally asked, his tone as cold as the room. Ella met his gaze steadily. "No excuses. Sir, I made a decision based on the information I had. I acted, and it worked. I would do it again." For her, that was all that mattered. She had followed her instincts, and in doing so, had proven that, sometimes, breaking the rules was exactly what was needed to ensure survival.